Then do we need the electric? They need mine. No, they mine. No, they need this one because it's got the. Well, it's better because. But is there a way of just checking before we start everything? Because it's always worked here, but not there.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with
Right. No, this is my sense of. Of well, the notion that you do planning through accretion rather than rough. It was a very good dinner.
Okay, apparently I'm gonna.
Just hold on one sec to make sure this works, because I think you're the only one who told me what to do. Because it's always worked on my screen. On this. Inappropriate. Is that it? That's the presentation. Yeah. I just don't know whether yesterday was the same standard. Yes. What are the development zones? Soil. Soil. No, there's a problem with the technology. You think it works? I mean, otherwise they should switch. No, but since you have the other guy's ready, you want to... if if there's still a problem. No, otherwise you change. Maybe you have the second speaker first. Change speaker. Because his was working okay. Or the other one. For the other speaker. So maybe if you want to start, you have him speak first.
No problem.
To say if you get the other guy to start and do the PDF. But is that but it's completely absolutely fine.
A ver si ahora sí.
That's another computer. It's the wrong charger.
A ver.
Yeah, but it's sorry. This is not going to work. Nothing works. No, nothing works. Nothing
But
works.
let me make sure that here there.
Literally doesn't work. You know the phrase, we do weddings. You know this phrase? You know this one?
Le
We
solicitamos
do also
ocupen
do
sus
it.
asientos para dar inicio con la primera conferencia del día de hoy. Richard Burdett es director del programa de urbanismo de la Escuela de Economía de Londres y fue el consejero principal de urbanismo para los Juegos Olímpicos de Londres en el año del 2002. Su investigación está enfocada en las interacciones entre el mundo físico y social en la ciudad contemporánea y en cómo la urbanización afecta la sustentabilidad social y ambiental. Es profesor invitado en el programa de Planificación Urbana y Diseño de la Universidad de Harvard, miembro de la Comisión de Aeropuertos Independientes del Gobierno británico y miembro del Consejo de la Universidad Real de Arte en Londres. Con ustedes, Richard Burdett.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this warm welcome to your wonderful city. I want to start by apologizing that I'm not speaking in Spanish. I could try and speak in Italian, but maybe that's not a good idea. But I want to thank all the wonderful friends, both old and new, in Mexico, in Arquine and Mextrópoli, for organizing this extraordinary event. What I want to do in the time I have available is to summarize some of the big issues that we at the London School of Economics have been studying now for about 10 years. In fact, we started our work, I'll come back to that several times, just about here in Mexico City in 2006. But I want to focus, as you can see from the title here, also on your city a little bit, because I'm not at all an expert, and on the city where I work and live, London, to show you some of the initiatives, some of the projects, which I think deal with some of the key issues that Miguel introduced yesterday morning at the start of the conference of how do you link big picture planning to issues of density, to issues of design, to issues of quality of life. And as you heard in the introduction, this relationship between the form of the city, the shape of the city, and the social well-being is at the heart of the work that we do. The title of my talk is actually taken from a book that Dejan Sujic and I published a few years ago. And actually, the title reflects very much our inspiration of being in this city. Why? Because for a number of years, as I've said, we've been doing research around the world and holding conferences in different cities. You can see them reflected here. In 2006, we came, as I said, to Mexico City. And when we had to think of a title, of a theme that would capture this work that we're doing, and we were confronted by this image, the notion of actually talking about the endless city, could be Mexico City, goes on and on and on in many ways. But also the fact that the world, as we've heard and as you know, is becoming more and more urban, is at the heart of what we did. So Mexico itself, Mexico City, has a sort of strong presence in that. And I think the one thing to remember, and we've heard it already yesterday, you all know it from the work you've been doing wherever you live, in whatever part of the world, whatever part of Mexico, is that there is no such thing as the generic city. Richard Sennett spoke a lot about this yesterday, as did others, and I'll come back to that. And that ultimately we have choices as architects, there are many in the room, as urban planners, and most importantly, and I'm going to come back to this again and again, as politicians, we have choices in the way that we make cities. Mexico City at one level is like that. London at one level is like this. They're cities with very different histories. They've grown over different periods of time, with different cultures, different politics, and different people. But it's trying to understand what is underneath that skin of the form of the city, which is what we have been doing at LSE Cities for a number of years. Density seems to be a major theme that Pedro Gadaño also talked about yesterday, as did Miguel. And I just want to start, I'll come back to these again, with a different way of looking at these two cities. It's the density of number of people who live on the left-hand side in Mexico City and on the right-hand side in London. The taller the graph, the more people live together. If this room, this auditorium, had 6,000 people, you would have much taller parts of the graph. If it had only 100 people, it would be very, very flat. So you can see here that even though Mexico City is not a city with very tall buildings, it is actually relatively dense, but of course not as dense as many other cities, but denser than London. One of the biggest factors, of course, and you know this well, and you can see it from the air and you can experience it on the ground, that some cities, you just need to take a look at this picture. All of this, by the way, is a totally private part of the City of London. It's owned by one family and has been for the last 200 years. The statistics are really quite dramatic. In London, it's a luxury in terms of quality of life, 36 square meters per person of green space. If you take parks and some of the natural reserves, but not the natural forests in the wider Mexico City area, that area is reduced to nearly just over 2 square meters per person. Now, I know that this is one of the major initiatives that all of you interested in making the city more habitable and improving the quality of life are looking at. But there are many cities which are much worse than this one. We started studying Mexico City together with others a few years back when, as you can see here, Mexico City, New York, and London were growing, but not at all at the rates of some of these other cities that you see here. Understanding the effect of growth on the quality of life is something I want to talk about. But we really need to understand what's going on out there. And this is a map showing in yellow where the United Nations is telling us with sort of factual accuracy, where in yellow cities will grow in the next 15 years. In green is where they've grown in the last sort of 20, and in the dark green in the last 50 years or so. And you can see here, your city, of course, grew an enormous amount in the last 20 years, and growing much less. In fact, the yellow is thinner, but it's pretty clear where the growth is actually going to happen. And in fact, it might be difficult to read from the back some of these cities, but Mexico City is growing a bit at about a rate of 1.5%, more than London, more than New York. But it's cities like Nairobi, like Lagos, like Kinshasa, like Kabul, which are the ones that are growing most and at greatest speeds. These, on the whole, are very poor cities in poor countries, which at the moment are low energy. So one of the biggest issues for us is how do we make cities more sustainable? It's a word which is overused, but I want to use it in two very precise ways: in social terms and environmental terms. In social terms, we know that, again, because of projections from the UN, 1 out of every 3 of you, if anywhere in the world, would be living in a slum without access to basic infrastructure. The other statistic, which is equally bracing, is the environmental one, which is because cities are what they are. They bring people together to work, to do things, to exchange culture, to exchange business, jobs, education. They consume energy, and therefore they contribute to 75% of world CO2 emissions. So a small change, 1 or 2 or 3% in the footprint of our cities is massive in terms of the climate. That's why so many of the major sort of global policymakers are turning the attention to, let's call it, our subject. I'm from the London School of Economics. I have to show some technical graphs, otherwise just pictures is not enough. And I can't really compete with some of the other speakers in this series. So I want to show you one, I think, important graph, which I hope you will remember. This is a graph which along this axis here shows, the closer it is to me, the longer life expectancy, better health, higher education values, and better income. Along the vertical axis is how much energy we use per person, roughly speaking. It is no surprise that the United States is way up there. High quality of life, enormous levels of energy consumption. Europe is roughly here, you're roughly over here. The most important line here is the dotted line. This is the amount of energy we consume in one Earth. So the United States requires 5 global Earths for survival. We all know this, right? The Phoenix, Arizona sprawl, Los Angeles, is unsustainable because of this. But the question, which is the right question that anyone asks anywhere in the world, is if we are going to improve our quality of life, how much energy do we end up using? And what can a city do? And the question for us is, can we begin to design cities that you, like Copenhagen, like Stockholm, and to a degree now like London, you improve the quality of life but actually reduce the energy per person. This is the big dilemma, let's call it, in terms of city planning. And this is why economists like Ed Glazer from Harvard has been talking with great intensity about the fact that it's important to bring people closer together but in efficient ways. Now, efficiency, and I'll talk about density in a moment, can be talked about in economic terms. These graphs, very simply, we don't need to go through it in too much detail, but let's take your country. This is from a few years back. The average income in this, across this city is much higher than the average income in the rest of Mexico. Right? That happens in every single city except for Berlin and Germany, by the way, where it's actually the other way around. Cities are about making money, about generating profit, and should be also about distributing social equity. And this is where the density maps come in, I think, in a significant way. Here you see, for example, London, which is roughly 4 or 5 story buildings, which is pretty low density, and you saw how green it was. Shanghai, much taller buildings now in the center, is beginning to shoot up. These two cities, London and New York, have the same population, but basically 9 million people live in half the area in New York than they do in London. And Mumbai, which is made up mainly of 2-story buildings, has one of the highest densities in the world. I'm not saying that's the best model. It's a model that we need to understand, and Pedro's wonderful exhibition has been looking at that. You kindly, Pedro, referred to my show at the Biennale in 2006, where I actually literally made physical models of these cities so that you can understand the difference. Let's look at 2 other important aspects which come to what one might do to Mexico City in a very substantive way. And I'm just going to take 3 cities, London, New York, and Hong Kong, to compare some very important elements. Where people live, where they sleep, basically, and where they come to work, which is, how do you get here for this event? How do you go to school? How do you go to the office every day? Well, this is London. We've seen it before. This is the system of transport that has been built up over 150 years, which keeps the city going. Incredibly expensive. It's taken a long time to get there, 150 years, but it actually supports a city of this size. This is New York, I've already said, much denser, with this sort of system of transport which has been invested for years. Many who live in New York say not enough. But probably this is the apotheosis, the best model of all when it comes to this issue of efficiency, which is Hong Kong. Again, 7-8 million people in a tiny, tiny footprint by comparison to others, with this sort of system of transport. Now, look at these density diagrams. These are new pieces of work that we've done at the LSE, and they compare on the left-hand side, and I'm going to show you 3 slides. On the left-hand side, where people live, exactly the same model that I showed you before. But on the right-hand side, where people work. So this is roughly 400,000 or 500,000 people coming into central London every day, quite a lot of them through public transport. But you can see that to go from that to that, you need a very efficient and, let's call it, important infrastructure investment. This is the same in New York, the same maps. More people live, as you know, in taller buildings closer together in New York, but even more people going out of the ceiling of this enormous room actually come to work, something like 700,000 people a day, using mainly public transport. But this is Hong Kong. I'm not advising to anyone here we want to live in Hong Kong. That's not the point of what I'm saying. I'm saying, how do we understand the dynamics of cities? But what is fascinating here is that the density of living, residential, the density of work are much closer together, which is therefore no surprise when you see these maps that 93% of the population of Hong Kong uses public transport to get to work. 93%, but also with travel times, commuting times, and I think in Mexico City this number is going to mean a lot to you, between 11 minutes and 20 minutes on average for a city of 7-8 million people. I think in Mexico City it's a bit more than that. Here's your city. We did some work a number of years ago looking at the density. Some of these figures maybe are 6 or 7 years out of date. But it's interesting to just look at the fact that you have, I think the numbers Jose Castillo was telling me yesterday are slightly different. It's now 82% using more or less public transport, and cars are slightly, but cars are still very much part, of course, of your daily life. Now, of course, you're in many ways, as we've seen from those early maps of growth, a relatively young city. The fact from a small town to becoming a 20 million plus urban conurbation has actually happened in the last 30, 40 years effectively. And what you see in this map is the density of major public transport lines, only major public transport lines. And if you look at it, you'll recognize it. But if you compare it to other cities around the world, you can see that there's, what can I say, some more to go to get to the sort of density of London or New York or Shanghai for that matter, which is investing at the same time. Now this perhaps is unkind and unfair, but don't take it as a criticism of your city. You should take it as something of where does one want to go, what sort of model, and soon I'm going to talk about what's happening in London from that respect. London has something like 1,400 kilometers of rail and roughly 400 of underground. Mexico City, of course, this is a few years back, now has more rail, a lot more BRT, which I saw yesterday, which I was incredibly impressed by. And the metro, of course, is a big and hot subject in this room, so I'm not going to say anything else. But I think what is important here is to try and understand what level of infrastructure do you need to support a sustainable city. You can't talk about these issues without the people who started the conference yesterday and others who are sitting here, without understanding governance. Many of you are architects, are going to become wonderful designers, wonderful planners, wonderful urban designers. But without understanding who makes the decisions, this was of course Saskia Sassen's excellent point yesterday morning, without understanding not only who owns the city, but who makes the decisions, I think we're actually operating in the dark. And Mexico City, to all of us, is an extraordinary example of perhaps not the best way of governing a large city. What can I say? Because when you look at it, and you can recognize in this map the darker gray areas where built form is, roughly where people live and work, and that is the Distrito Federal, and that is the area outside it, which is the Estado de Mexico. You have a split, a fundamental split in making decisions which are significant in terms of the metropolitan region. There are many attempts, some of which I'm familiar, and I'm sure many more which have happened in the last year to try and reorganize the regional decision making. But without getting that right, you can't get water systems, you can't get environmental systems, housing policies, or transport to work properly. And don't think that we've got it right anywhere else. London, for example, and I'll talk about it, has something, and I'll describe it in a moment, called the Green Belt, whereby the mayor is responsible for one area like that. But New York has exactly your problem. The mayor is responsible for a very small percentage of actually what one might call the functional regional area. I'm not trying to be a sort of political scientist in an event like this. I'm just trying to say, without understanding these ambiguities and these difficulties, it's sometimes impossible to come up with solutions. London reinvented its political system exactly 15 years ago. We have never had a mayor, never had a directly elected mayor. We reinvented it. Now we have a mayor who is responsible for all these areas here, and there is no Estado de Mexico. There's no sort of area in between. While in New York, interestingly, the state of New York, like the state of Texas, in orange, in yellow here, actually has an enormous say and owns the transport authority. So one of the reasons New Yorkers complain about transport is because the decisions are taken by people elsewhere, 500 kilometers away, in fact, and there isn't that level of investment. So having painted this sort of bigger picture of what the issues are in terms of understanding cities, understanding the dynamics and the relationship between form, infrastructure, and social well-being, let me now talk perhaps a bit personally about the city that I work in and have been involved in a number of projects. And let me stress, in any event like this, it's not to say that we've got it right. In fact, there are a number of things about London which are highly problematic, including cost of living, social inequality, and a massive problem of housing, much worse than you have here. But it's a city which nonetheless has sort of over the years reinvented itself, partly because of the political reinvention. Saskia Sassen, of course, has written extensively about the points of a global city. She invented the term, effectively, many years ago. But London, like New York, like Tokyo, and like others, function because they are part of the flows, the global flows of people, of goods, of money, and of course of information. And maintaining that openness is fundamental. That's why the future of an airport becomes as significant in Mexico City as it is in London. And that is why, perhaps in the case of London, whatever way you look at it, it tends to sort of come at the top or near the top of one of these global rankings. But this is probably the most important image I want you to remember of London. It's not the glitzy one, it's the real demographic of inequality effect. This is called the index of multiple deprivation. On the darker red, this is a scale, is the worst deprived. That means less educated, lower life expectancy, I'll come back to that, and less education, higher unemployment. The green is exactly the opposite end. So if that is London, and you recognize it through the River Thames and this sort of bump in the River Thames, that's the sort of major defining feature for our city, you'll see an odd situation for cities. We've studied over 60 cities like this. You actually have the edges of the city, the edges, all around the edge, the periphery is actually affluent. Very, very different from here. Right? Very different from Paris, for example. And some areas of central London, and mainly East London, which is over here, and South London, are very red, exactly the opposite. Now, I mentioned that being at the London School of Social, I've forgotten the name of my institution, the LSE, yes. We need to be very serious about the work we do, right? So we did this map, right? Which I've taken the liberty of translating, so, which is, you know, you have a river, you've got these guys, and the perdidors, right? Which is, and you know, if you apply this to your city, and this is a different color, the darker green is actually the less affluent, most deprived, right? And the lighter green is the opposite. You well know that in this city, like many Latin American cities, in fact, the most deprived are pushed to the edges of the city and have to suffer the costs of lack of infrastructure, long commuting times, and lack of basic services. But that you understand, you recognize. Most of the policymakers in the city are very clear about that and want to address it. In my city, you have this extraordinary situation that if you take one of the major Jubilee, one of the underground lines called the Jubilee line, and you happen to live or born in a place in the west side of London called Westminster, every time you take one of these stations, you go eastwards to where the Olympic site is, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. As a man, today, not 100 years ago, every stop you lose 1 year of life expectancy. That's the same difference between Buenos Aires and Quito, and the same difference between Ho Chi Minh City and Hong Kong, right? In one city. So we're talking about literally continental differences of equity. And does design, does planning have something to do with it? Can it intervene in that debate? I obviously wouldn't be here if I didn't think that that was possible. So how have we dealt with this in London? What are the sort of projects we've been involved with? And what is the policy framework that we tried to make these decisions? Now, the first thing is that Mexico City, other parts of the world which are actually growing, it's only good news. The worst situation to have is actually deal with a city where you have the opposite. You have shrinking cities. Think of cities in Russia. Think of Detroit in the United States, where you have loss of jobs, young people actually getting out and leaving. That is actually a serious problem. In London, we're now growing. We're growing much more than expected, mainly through increased birth rate, but also by large amounts of migration from the wider European Union in particular. I'm one of the people, like many Londoners, I have to say, who believe that this is the best news possible. We are increasing sort of the variety of life and the difference, exactly what Richard Sennett was talking about yesterday. How do you then design the city to deal with that difference is, I guess, the key challenge, which is what I'm going to describe to you in a moment. Now, I've described to you London as a map with the River Thames going through it. London occupies roughly the shape that you see over here, and most of the area to the east, on my side, because it's where the big port, you can see the river getting wider and wider and going out to the open sea, the major port of the British Empire in the 18th, 19th, and part of the 20th century was, most of the industrial areas relating to the docks and the activities were located on the east side of London. In the 70s, brutally, like any other port city, particularly in Europe, and also parts of America, containerization actually effectively closed that market. That meant hundreds of thousands of unemployment, and that's why the red that you saw of multiple deprivation is so concentrated in this part of East London. It also means, of course, that there's an enormous amount of empty space. So when you have a mayor like this guy who points that way, it's about where are you going to drive the future of the city. And Boris Johnson, the current mayor, and Ken Livingstone, the mayor I used to work with before with Richard Rogers, have consistently said we've got to solve the east-west inequality in our city. You have a sort of periphery center inequality, you could call it that. And the way to do that is to go east and to therefore improve these areas, which are at the moment available, by retrofitting them with better public transport and better quality public spaces and better quality design and mix of uses. So how do you do that? Well, you do that with a plan. You do it with a very simple vehicle called a plan. We call it the London Plan. Now, one thing we've had in London since 1943, so nearly 60 years plus, is a very simple concept invented by the father of British 20th century planning, Sir Patrick Abercrombie, when London was becoming a little bit what Mexico City then became, a sprawling megalopolis, right? And in 1943, he made the decision that London should have a belt, literally a belt around it, and called it the Green Belt. The Green Belt extends for about 10, 15, sometimes 30 kilometers around the edges, and then you can build again. This effectively has made London survive as a more or less sustainable city, and the connections between the new towns outside and the center you saw in that map before. So when Ken Livingstone, the first directly elected mayor in 2001, yesterday morning in terms of the life of London, had to make a decision about what would the plan be, he came up with this. A number of architects, as I mentioned before, Richard Rogers, were involved in that, and that's exactly what you should continue and you are beginning to do here, to really rethink where the city needs to go. Normally, plans are documents this thick, impossible to read, right? We all get bored. If in an architecture school, that's not something we're interested in. I can describe, I think, in about a minute, the London Plan. The first thing it does, it says even though London is growing, it's got to stay within exactly the limits set in the 1940s. It cannot grow beyond that. So there's that 30-kilometer green belt is preserved. Secondly, because there is an enormous amount of available land, ex-industrial land, post-industrial land, make those special sites, you see the little stars, opportunity areas, and allow private and public sector to build more as long as one thing happens, that is well supplied by public transport. In other words, higher densities, mix of uses, but connected to the rest of the city in where those stars are. And then the third fundamental thing is to privilege some areas of London as opposed to others. In other words, pour more investment ultimately in these two corridors, northeast and east, which are the most unequal areas of the city. These are the points of the London Plan. It's very flexible. If I take Richard Sennett's comment at the end of his talk yesterday about not having master plans but having sort of more flexible nodal planning or something like that, if I caught it, it's very much this approach. It's a very simple idea which can change and adapt to things over time. So it's about the green belt, it's about allowing density only where there's public transport, rebalancing social equity across the city as a whole, emphasizing development corridors, and focusing on these opportunity areas in different parts of the city. The most significant thing we have done, I think, by lobbying central government is to get nearly $23 billion from central government to invest in this high-speed rail being built in London now. I'll come back to this at the end. How have we dealt with the existing part of the city? What are these sort of strategies about filling in the large gaps within the sort of wider social and environmental plan that I've described? Well, I'm going to show you 3 or 4 projects and some architectural initiatives which deal with this at a very detailed level. The first is a private sector, totally private sector-led $3 billion development in this area here called King's Cross. As you see, it's actually in one of the quite deprived areas of London, one of the more red areas as I've described it before. But it's an area which is fantastically well connected in terms of rail. It's been like that for about 150, if not longer, years. It's where the Eurostar link connects us to what many English still call the continent, right? But it's also where, through this extraordinary station, but it's also where historically goods used to come to London through canals, rail, and other activities. So it's connected south and east across Europe and north and also to the rest of the city. It has an amazing network of underground connections and rail connections. And the first thing that was done is that stations, which in this case are not new, they've been there for a long time, have been renewed. So this station by King's Cross Station, which is a 19th century station, has been renewed, as you see, I think very dramatically, very effectively, by the architect John McCaslin. What we're talking about is a vast hole in the middle of the city. It's exactly like some of your development areas, post-industrial areas, but in this case, with an enormous advantage of the transport actually being there. Not that much had to be done. This is the route to Paris. This is the route up to the north. This was a picture actually not that many years ago. You recognize that situation in your city. There are many more sites which are becoming available. And this is the master plan done by the architects Allies and Morrison, which was envisaged a number of years ago. I'm going to talk through it very briefly to give you a sense. The most important thing when one talks about master plans is not just talk about it in terms of what happens within the red line of the site. This is an area which down at the bottom has university areas, a lot of social housing from the early 20th century, a lot of social housing from the 1950s and 60s. It's a very, very mixed area with a sort of feel that you have around railway stations, which sometimes is not absolutely wonderful, but it's that grunginess also that is what makes up cities. Not everything has to be super clean and policed, and as was said yesterday. So the master plan, which you see here, very much looks at filling in the space, but also making sure it connects to the surrounding. This is an image of what it was like about 30, 40 years ago. These are the master plan images. There's the big site, big sort of white empty area before. The 2 stations are over there. The canal cuts through over there. Diagrams by the architects, as I say, Allies and Morrison, to emphasize that wherever there's a street in the surrounding areas, every effort possible is made to actually cut through it, to integrate it, exactly what Richard Sennett was talking about in terms of porosity, to try to maximize that wherever possible. And then pepper pot, different uses. Even though, let me stress, this is a private sector-led development, it doesn't feel like that. There's a university in the middle of it, there are many other activities. So the whole of the ground floor is effectively animated by retail and by other activities. Outward looking rather than inward looking. This is what the master plan actually looks like. The result of this development has been to trigger other things around the site. It was absolutely not a given that now one of the major medical research centers in the world has actually moved right next to the site. And this is extraordinary, that in this building over here, right there, 12,000 very funky people who work for Google are going to be moving into a new headquarters. They've looked apparently at every other site in Europe and decided that this was the place to be. Now, if you think of the connectivity and you think of the potential of the site, it makes sense. There are also occasions for actually rather beautiful buildings. But the most important thing here is to think of it as a piece of city, not as a development. as a part of continuity in terms of layering of different types of activities. This was an artist's impression of a David Chipperfield building right next to the two stations. This is a fantastic 18th century granary building which has a public space in front of it, turned by the architect Stanton Williams into the University of the Arts, which now has 5,000 students right at the heart of the space. It's alive every hour of the day and night. That's the big difference. This is the David Chipperfield building recently completed, and a lot of student housing, including LSE housing, by the architects McCreener Lavington. Now, that's a very particular site which shows sort of this approach of integration. In some cases, you don't have that scope. You have to fill in the bits that you can find. And of course, in the financial hub, the Wall Street of London, which we call confusingly the City of London with a capital C, which is over here, which is where London was born 2,000 years ago, so to speak, settled by the Romans, there's been exactly what we see when we look out of the window at the Reforma, in terms of a concentration of taller buildings, and these are mainly office blocks over here. Now, we haven't got everything right. Let me stress that. I'm going to show you some projects which are okay, and some projects, that's okay, but some projects which are horrible, and some projects which are going to be even worse. Right? So it's not a given. But what is important here is that the density is going where there is more public transport concentration than anywhere else in London. Not one of these buildings has got a car parking space except for disabled people. Not one. Right? When we went with Teodoro González de León to his extraordinary building and saw 16 levels of below ground parking, I was absolutely shocked. And so was he, saying we have a regulation which forces us to do that. New building by Richard Rogers called the Cheese Grater. For those of you who like Parmigiano, you will recognize why. Which has, I think, only 4 or 5 parking spaces right next to the Lloyd's of London. Rem Koolhaas designed one of his most delicate buildings, again in this heart of this very dense city fabric, with an enormous imagination going to how this building actually meets the ground. There isn't a lot of tarmac and parking space. It immediately sort of fits into the city. And as I say, then we made a few pretty terrible errors, including this one by Raphael Vignoli, which, because of its curvature, concentrates the sun and fries eggs on the front of cars. So it's actually that problematic. They've had to, you all probably know Renzo Piano's building on the other side of the river, a fascinating building, which was built right on top of a railway station. 10,000 people are now living and working here. There are 37 car parking spaces only for disabled people. And this is exactly the way in which sort of sustainability can work at the detailed level. I'm saying it's not perfect, but it's one way to go. The role of culture, I think, is totally understood here, and it's the last project I'm going to show you before turning to the London Olympics. But the Tate Modern, imaginatively redesigned by Herzog de Meuron now 15 years ago, is actually reinventing itself only after 15 years. It's brought millions of people, in fact 5 million people a year, to the south side of the river, which was in a way a no-go area. And the extension by Herzog de Meuron is well underway and it will open in 2 years. This is an artist's impression of what it will look like. So the whole of the south side of the river, in one of the poorer areas but well connected, think of the London plan diagram that I showed you, is about that. Canary Wharf is the sort of the Santa Fe of London. Not a place I enjoy because it did all the wrong things. It created a sort of island, no connection to the surrounding, and only office buildings, a sort of dead zone after 5:30. But because, and this is Norman Foster's new Crossrail station is opening there in 2 years' time, what have they realized? Well, they've got this land here. There's an enormous need for housing in London. This is the volume they've been given in terms of development opportunity because of the Crossrail connection. And Herzog de Meuron is building now one of the residential towers, and this whole development to my right, which is 8 million square feet, so 800,000 square meters, will actually have 25% of social housing as part of it. This is not a perfect way to do things, but it's a way to do things. Let me then end with the London Olympics. This is a project which I think is interesting to share. It's totally at the initial stage of in terms of its actually realization as a piece of city, but it's part of this very important connection of what I call accretion, of doing pieces of urbanism which stick together with the surrounding rather than a tabula rasa approach, which is the way the whole concept of the London Olympics was created. There are many of you here from Barcelona. We stole the idea from Barcelona. How can you use the excuse of getting a lot of money from central government to effectively make something that for the period of the games is closed, cut off from the surrounding, but then becomes an integrated piece of city. You've had to deal with this here in the past. This could look like Canary Wharf. It could look like any of the sites that you know in your city, which is a post-industrial site. This is what the site where the Olympics is settled, which is the far end of that Jubilee line where life expectancy drops. Okay, remember that is literally here, right? It's this sort of area around here. When I visited the site in 2005, this is what we saw. Actually, you know, half close your eyes, it's quite pretty. But there's one thing you notice, these things. You know, it's not a good idea to live under high electricity pylons. Sometimes, in other parts of the world, it happens. The area surrounding it is one of London's ethnically most diverse areas in terms of different populations from different parts of the world. Incredibly vibrant culture, quite poor, but very dynamic. This is what that site was mainly used for. It's called Fridge Mountain. My fridge, I'm sure, is somewhere here. In a moment, I'll show you what it was actually like. But this is what cities are. They need places which are sort of the back, but then they can become the front, and in a way, that's the challenge. When you have a lot of public money, in this case, what you do, you spend the first $400 million in getting rid of this, putting all the electricity underground, and creating land for future development. In quick succession, I'm just going to show you the master plan for the Olympic site. The Mayor of London acquired this site. Right? So it actually belongs, the freehold, the ground belongs to the mayor. Very important thing to remember. Different parts over time are then leased, given out on a long-term rent, effectively, maybe 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, some cases 99 years, to private developers to do things. But all within the plan I'm about to show you. So this land started like that. I've shown you pictures of the fact that it actually has a nice river and quite a lot of green around it. So why not make a park at the center of it with some water? Then, given that this area was an industrial area and there was only one route through it, in a very, very large piece of city, use public money to make 38 new bridges and connections. This is the porosity argument literally shown in front of you. Then, very importantly, don't just use it for housing, but use this for jobs and put those close to public transport and housing in other parts of it. Most importantly, use the Olympic event just to build something that London didn't have. We don't have an Olympic-sized swimming pool, we don't have a velodrome, but everything else that you don't need, for example, in English weather, there's no point in playing water polo, right? No reason. So no point in keeping a structure like that. But then take things away, invest in the land, make it less polluted or depolluted, and make it accessible in terms of public transport. So you have 5 or 6 big pieces of potential city over there. I think this, for me, was the most important, not very sexy, image of the Olympics. And it drove through a friend of Jose Castillo and mine called Andy Altman, who was the chief executive of the Olympic Legacy Delivery Group. It drove the whole idea that what you do for 2012 will actually only be realized in this sort of time frame. And I know that Tokyo is beginning to think in very similar ways. So what is that? It's basically in this area, create a master plan done again by Allies and Morrison, the same people who did the King's Cross project, which over time, and the question of over time is very significant. Again, yesterday in some of the conversations, the notion of not doing things in one go, not doing the Canary Wharf, which happens an instant city over time, because you can't get that sort of complexity and layering which is sort of necessary. And there you see, literally, the plan is not all phased in one part, so you do it at the beginning, but it's scattered in different parts of it. And this is what I call planning by accretion as opposed to by rupture. But also the timing element is very significant. This is exactly where Fridge Mountain was, okay? Just to give you a sense, in the space of 7-8 years, what you can actually do. Sometimes we get, half gray skies with even a little bit of sun, and people are able to sit outside in London, and this is actually what it's like. This is the rather beautiful velodrome designed by Hopkins architects, Michael Hopkins and partners, which is now used by anyone who lives in the surrounding area. Everything for the Olympics, as you know, has to be uber-designed, over-designed. So to deal with sometimes 200,000 people coming in and out of an event or several events at one time. So nearly everything was designed to cope with the maximum flow, but then reduced down to what might be called a proper urban dimension. This costs money. All the bridges were actually built to be as wide as this theater. Now, if you then make a piece of city and you live there, a bridge this size is completely unacceptably large, right? So what was done is that all these structures were built in two parts, and the brown bit was actually taken down and the material sold to build other structures. This whole approach of sustainability, of only invest in what you need, was used in this actually beautiful structure for the basketball stadium, but the Brits they're not tall enough to play basketball, so there's, again, no point in keeping it. But even Zaha Hadid, the great Zaha Hadid, referred to this building in not very elegant terms, right? Said, it's really ugly, it really looks like shit. And why did it look like shit? Because the swimming pool, which is a beautiful structure, had to have 17,000 seats to make money for the IOC. It's the most watched sport right at the beginning of the game. So these are all temporary. The whole plan was to build the building, but then bring it back to exactly what Zaha had in mind, and she's much happier with this, and particularly this. So at the moment, you can swim in this area for $2 a day if you live in the neighborhood. So it's retrofitting the sort of this community over time. These are images of what's actually happening or will happen in the area right next to the Zaha swimming pool over there in the major stadium. And in this site over here, actually to everyone's surprise, there's now a competition for one of the major museums in central London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, one of the major universities in London after the LSE, of course, moving over there, and some other sort of social facilities, actually moving new parts of their organization to this neighborhood, which now has a public space of extraordinary quality. Let me begin to wind down and finish the presentation by just looking at a number of examples around this site and how it constitutes an approach which is made up of these concepts of pieces of city, not just development sites which are somehow interconnected and represent the DNA of London as a whole. This is an extension of the Olympic Village, which you see over here, which is now being developed under the master plan I showed you. I mentioned this critical thing. The land is owned by the Mayor of London through the Mayoral Legacy Corporation. A private developer has a 99-year lease on it, which could be renewed over time. But in that way, they control the height of the buildings, the uses, the mix of social housing to private housing, etc. That's a fundamental way to then make a piece of city, a piece of London, which represents what is there. Now, this is what I hope, as a legacy, we will be able to use for the rest of London, but I'm actually unhappy that it's not going that way. All these areas to the east of London are now being looked at, just as in this city, areas which are today industrial, tomorrow will not necessarily be so. What are you going to actually do with them, I think, is the biggest challenge that we all share. So if that's East London, that's the Olympic sites, that's Canary Wharf, you can see this vast area over here, which is being considered as a series of sort of big chunks of urban development. But all of this is within this one vision, which I showed you of the London plan. And it's interesting how two mayors of very, very different parties, who hardly talk to each other, right, when they meet, basically have believed and stick to the same story. That's a fundamental issue, that you don't tear up the plan because you have someone else of the new party. I think in that way, you can begin to deal with this issue of sustainability, because it takes much longer than a presidential election or a mayoral election to actually deal with these things. In listening to some of the points yesterday, I just wanted to conclude with these thoughts, that probably the best solution, things we've learned from by studying cities around the world, is the tabula rasa model that we've employed for decades now. Probably doesn't work, and subtle retrofitting must be the right thing to do. That density and public transport have to swing together is also a must. The notion that time through accretion, overlaying rather than rupture with context, is significant. Porosity as opposed to impermeability is another aspect which relates to social equity and allowing change and integrating that change over time. Again, Richard Sennett talked about the notion of not creating master plans which give you certainty, because you can have unexpected things like earthquakes, you can have wars, you can have 9/11, which completely change the things. Most importantly, as we heard from Saskia, you can have another global economic meltdown. And what do you do when the city stops growing? And I think issues of land ownership and governance are at the heart of making sustainable cities which are better connected. And I can't resist but end with two images. This is a picture of London, a bit obvious. And this is a picture I took together with Miguel Adrià and others when we were at the top floor of Todeuro's new building. And maybe the two cities are getting closer and closer together. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. En 5 minutos continuaremos